You have now arrived at your destination.
Matt, I'm so excited for this show. Obviously, we have to thank the main man, Shaq, for making this one happen. I've wanted to do it for a long time, so thank you so much for joining me first.
It's really a pleasure to finally connect in this format.
It totally is, as I said, thrilled to make it happen. But I want to start today, and we see the incredible journey that you've been on with WordPress and Automattic. But I want to go back just for the beginning to set some context. How did you come up with the idea for WordPress and Automattic? And take me back to that starting aha moment in the early days.
Yeah, so WordPress was very much born out of open source. So I didn't come up with any idea. Blogging was already happening. There was lots of tools, including like LiveJournal, Blogger, etc. But I wanted something that was open source. So I started using some software called B2 Cafe Log, actually from a developer out of Corsica, France. And started volunteering on the forums, helping other people out, contributing code. And then what happened was that software actually was abandoned. The developer kind of disappeared. And myself and a gentleman in the UK named Mike Little said, "Hey, we really like this." We were both kind of contributors and part of the community, so we're like, "Hey, why don't we, pick up this torch and keep it going?" Because it seemed like really valuable software. In open source, that's called forking, fork like you would eat with. And now the main thing with forking is, I mean, one of the beauties of open source is you could take all the code, but you need to come up with a new name. So that's a friend in Houston suggested the name WordPress, and we were off to the races.
I want to ask a question from Tony Schneider, actually. And he asked, when he first met you, he said, how long do you want to work on WordPress and Automatic for? And you very clearly said within seconds, decades. And he was taken aback by your long term mindset. And he asked the question, when did you know this was a project that you wanted to commit decades of your life to?
I'd say pretty early on. So, first year of WordPress was very small, probably dozens of users. But it was fun in that the developers, myself and the others, were really having a good time working on it and collaborating. And we were all over the world. We never met each other, but that's how open source works. It was probably the second year that one, I got a job offer. So I got basically hired by a company called CNET and moved to San Francisco because of my work on WordPress. So that was pretty cool. That felt like winning the lottery. And then as WordPress started to get translated into other languages, I am unfortunately quite monolingual. I barely speak English that well, but I've always been fascinated with other languages. And particularly, WordPress was translated into Japanese. Now, what was this nowadays doesn't sound like a big deal, but what happened was a gentleman in Japan, we had no translation framework. So what he did was he actually went through every single line of the software, which must have been 60 to 80,000 lines at that point, and manually changed all the English text to Japanese, which was like, I can't even imagine how many dozens or hundreds of hours that took. And then I downloaded the software, I loaded it, and it was just one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in my life because it was like this interface and software that we've been working on, but with the really beautiful, Japanese scripts, katakana, hiragana, I think they're called. And I was just totally blown away. And I thought, wow, if this guy would take all this time to do it, maybe there's something bigger on our hands, and maybe we could have a bigger impact on the web. And shortly after that, maybe a year or two after that, we started to see WordPress show up in like whole internet numbers. And I remember the first time Google did a survey, and they found this weird header in HTTP responses that they were like, "We're not sure what this is, but it's on 0.8% of all the websites we looked at." And that was a header that WordPress added. And so, me and the other developers like popped some virtual champagne. We're like, "Oh my goodness, we're 0.8% of the websites out there," and it was just an incredible rush, an incredible feeling. It's really rewarding if you love the craft of software to make things that other people use. And I get really jazzed from, seeing what people do with the platforms we've created.
That's a pretty special feeling, and I'm going to be honest. I've stalked the shit out of you for the last few days, Matt. Now we knew each other before, but I mean, I have really stalked you, and it's been fascinating because there's been some real commonalities in everything that I've heard, actually, which is really interesting. And I'm going to kind of unpack them one by one, and we're going to start on your leadership. And so, when we think about high performance, I want to just start there and ask, what does high performance mean to you when I say those words, Matt?
Mm. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me is definitely communication. I feel like all great things I've been involved in, at least, were created from collaboration and teams. And communication is fundamentally, taking what's in our respective minds and finding that common ground. And then when you pair it with things like accountability, a shared mission, it's really the foundation where everything else grows on. So something that I continue to work on uh, really every week is how can I be a more clear, concise communicator, and how we can get our teams really aligned through clear communication. So yeah, communication is what comes to mind first.
So what I love is just like being able to go off on tangents. I'm always stuck on communication, on radical candor, and giving feedback in real time.
Yeah.
Sometimes you've had a stressful day, you've had a fight with your family member or whoever, and it's not right to do it in the moment, but then other people say it is. How do you
Mm.
feel about giving feedback in real time versus delaying it, and knowing when and how to do quite tough feedback relayal?
Yeah, well, there's two sides to communication, and I go back to a Frank Luntz quote a lot, where he said, "It's not what you say; it's what people hear." And another one I think about a lot might have been Maya Angelou, but I'm probably getting this wrong, which is like people will forget what you say, et cetera, but they'll remember how you made them feel.
Mhm.
So I think that it's important if you're, particularly if you're going to be critical of someone, it to make sure that they feel it's coming from a place of care and shared mission. Um, and probably doubly so because people naturally become defensive. But I also think it's something that as you build more trust with someone you're collaborating with, you can become better and better at having that just knowledge that it's from a place of trying to get better together. So,
Trust is so crucial there, as you mentioned. Do you start trusting people fully from day one and it's there to be lost? Or do you say, I'm going to learn to trust you over time? How do you think about your willingness to trust at the beginning?
I personally am very default trusting. Uh, and that also means that sometimes you pay what I call an optimism tax. My friend John Sten came up with that. And basically saying that, if you default to being optimistic and trusting, sometimes people will take care of you. But the rest of the time, the 99% of the time that people are taking advantage of you, your life will be much better. So occasionally I pay an optimism tax, but I would much rather like live my life in a way that is default trusting and optimistic towards yeah, pretty much everyone.
Can I ask? I think, so much of communication is also in storytelling. And I think actually we've lost the art of storytelling today, especially when it comes to great product marketing. How do you feel about what makes great storytelling and what makes great product marketing? Because it is such a core part of communication.
Mm. Yeah, this is something I personally struggle with a lot because I feel like I can get very lost in the nuance and the details. And there's a gentleman in the WordPress community actually named Chris Lema who is just so incredible. I think he has a background of like preaching where he can really tie it in with like a personal story that then goes someplace you didn't expect and then like comes back at the end. And I think it's an incredible form of communication. So probably something I should work on more and think about.
Okay, so if we think about that as something you'd like to work on and think about, I'd love to be reflective on your leadership style. How would you describe your style of leadership, and how has it changed over time?
I'm probably in many ways a non-traditional leader, and that Automatic is a very flat organization. Automatic's the company that I ended up building after WordPress, or on top of WordPress. It's a for-profit, about 2,000 people now, and I'm the CEO there. But we're very flat, particularly at the top, hierarchically. Um, Everything's sort of ultra transparent. We have no email. We communicate via blogging, and yeah, it's very global. So we've always been totally distributed from the beginning since 2005. So I have colleagues in 97 countries. So I feel like all these things, when you mix them up, I end up being a leader which uh, is normally um, giving folks a ton of space and then occasionally diving extremely deep into the details, as close as to like database schemas or code architecture or how we're going to approach something or a specific partnership. So I like being able to move between the sort of like 1 foot view and the 10,000 foot view. And a lot of what I'm doing as well is trying to create the environment for people to do well without me there. But then also kind of that maybe trust but verify, that sometimes they'll dive in and really try to learn part of something very deeply.
Can I ask, how do you approach the element of accountability with independence? You want people to be accountable, you want them to go big, but you also don't want to let them not be feared of failure, not be willing to engage. How do you think about that challenge of giving them enough accountability, but not too much?
Yeah, I think that where we've done that best is probably having clear goals and giving people a lot of flexibility for how to accomplish them. And where we've done it poorly is probably when myself or others get like a little too involved in how to do it, particularly if a team's doing well. So, but I think just if you're communicating which mode you're in. So, for example, in February, I took over as the CEO of Tumblr. And I've been running that personally day to day since then. And I told the team, like, hey, we're in a tough place right now. So I'm not going to be trying to build consistent consensus or other things. We're going to be in a bit of a command and control method for a little bit, where let's just try to do what I'm saying to do as quickly as possible, so we can kind of pull out of this dive. And I think that's fine if you communicate it, but it also is not sustainable. Like, I think that at some point, hopefully, when things start going better again, you can then step back and have just a different kind of leadership style. But much like Ben Horowitz talks about, like wartime versus peacetime CEO, I think that it's important to vary your leadership style based on who you're working with, the state of the team, and sort of what's going on. I think where we make or where I've made mistakes before is not being explicit about that. So I think it was actually really helpful for me to say, hey, this is going to be like top down for a little while. And then everyone knew what to expect. And where if I had just done that without saying that first, I feel like there probably would have been a lot more resistance or sort of passive aggression.
Do you think it's possible for many people to be both? I totally agree with you in terms of wartime and peacetime leadership and how you need to be both in
Mhm.
your tenure. But some people are wartime leaders and some are peacetime leaders, or think they are at least. Do you think many are plastic enough to be both?
Absolutely. Yeah. Because it's about behaviors, it's not about identity. Um, and I feel like I switch between them just in working with different businesses within our company. We have some businesses that are very mature, like WooCommerce, which is our e-commerce platform, or WordPress.com, which has millions of subscribers. And we have some that are very nascent. Actually, a podcasting app called Pocket Cast, which is a really good podcatcher. If you're listening to this on another one, check out Pocket Cast. So you can move between them at different times. And yeah, I think it's just all about behaviors. Behaviors probably in self awareness.
I have to ask, we spoke about the importance of communication, and then you mentioned not having email, and I kind of glossed over that, but I'm fascinated. How do you communicate by blog posts and not having email, Matt? Can you just walk me through this?
Yeah, so first I'll say what I like about email is that it's written, it's threaded, and it can be asynchronous, right? Like you can send something, I can reply on my own time. We don't have to be there at the same place. Now, what I really dislike about email is that it's private, meaning that so much intelligence in a company is locked into people's inboxes. And that means when new people join, they don't have access to all of that conversation and decision making. And when someone leaves, like in their inbox often leaves a ton of institutional wisdom and knowledge about the business. And so basically everything that most companies do on email, we just do on these internal blogs, including like, you might post something and say, hey, Matt, what do you think of these mockups? And then I would give your answer. And then maybe you post some more. And then maybe we do a user test and post that to the thread. Like we can have all that things there. And what's cool about this, the system's called P2. The letter P is in pool and then the number two. Um, what's cool about this is it becomes like an organizational blockchain, like a history of basically every decision we've made in the company for the past dozen years or so, including every partnership meeting, every investor meeting I've had, like pretty much everything's in there. And and it's all searchable, indexed, everything. And I try to lead by example. Myself and other executives were like, if I met with Scott Schleifer from Tiger, I post about that meeting and the whole company can see it. So we try to be really transparent, including when it might be uncomfortable too.
Are there any dangers of being too transparent? Say I'm on your team and I'm not performing,
Mhm.
and you're concerned about my lack of performance. Are you going to put that on the blog, even if I am useless?
Mm, not individually. Like, I do believe there is to an extent, like praise in public, criticize in private, particularly if it were more like a HR issue or personal performance. But a team performance or a division performance could definitely be on the blog. And we'd want to be really transparent there about where people stand relative to our goals. But I think for individual, you're right that I think, communicating privately would be better.
Now, I chatted to Shaq a couple of hours ago before, and obviously had many hours of chatting to Shaq about you and many stories that you guys have shared. He said one baller OG move was the Tumblr acquisition, and then obviously also you taking over as CEO. Can you just help me understand what was the decision-making process for you in terms of taking the helm and taking the reins as CEO, earlier this year?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, we bought Tumblr because it's a generational property. Like it's really amazing. It had been mismanaged, I think, under Yahoo and AOL and Verizon, and we felt like we could turn it around. The reason I ended up taking over as CEO is that the first 2 years of the acquisition, it had not turned around yet. So not an ideal circumstance, to be honest. But we ended up, a lot of the teams knew 85 or 90%. And then at some point, like I said earlier, I felt like I needed to go in and be a bit more hands-on with the business because while it's been reported that we bought Tumblr for very little. It has so much usage. It's actually quite expensive to run. So getting Tumblr to where it can be break even and sustainable is really critical. Now, fortunately, at our business, all the other businesses are doing very well and very profitable. So we kind of evens out at a full business level. But I think rightly so. Like uh, board and others looks at this and says, "Hey, why are we losing so much money on this thing?" Especially when it wasn't growing. What I'm really happy to say is that the team has done some amazing work over the past few months, and not only is Tumblr is like growing really in a really interesting way now, both usage and revenue. And we've launched a lot of features that have been really positive in the community. And I think it's actually super strategic for us over the next decade because Tumblr has a much younger user base than WordPress. The 60% of Tumblr's users are under the age of 25. They're majority female. They're primarily mobile, and so it's an amazing on ramp as well as if we can get people who start on Tumblr to someday actually be using WordPress. I think it's actually a pretty incredible um, thing that keeps WordPress relevant for much longer than we would have been otherwise.
Can I be challenging to your business model? And I hope this is okay for me to ask. But given how many profitable entities you have and how successfully they're doing, only having one in Tumblr that is loss making could suggest that you're actually not taking enough risk and you could leverage and subsidize more risky assets with the cash
Mhm.
flows of your profitable assets and really go for growth in a ton of more risky assets. Now, I appreciate the time that we're in now being a challenging time to go for growth and not profitability and cash flow. But have you thought about this balance between growth and profitability a lot more in terms of leveraging cash flow here to really subsidize growth here?
Totally. And we have done that in the past with the money we've raised. It's been primarily through acquisitions, though. Like we do like to have businesses which have good unit economics as you run them from the beginning. So between 2005 and I think 2014, all of Automatic was done with about 11 million in outside capital. Uh, those are also the years where Tony Schneider, came in as a CEO. In 2014, when we were passing the baton, we did about a year or two of work before that, where he was kind of like getting ready to pass over the CEO title to me. And one of the things that became clear as we were sort of planning for that and everything was one, building up the executive team, which we did, but two, that we were foregoing a lot of opportunities because we were essentially running the business at break even and only had, $10 million in the bank or something. Like we didn't have a lot of leeway, and the business was trying to remember the size, probably still sub 100 million, but getting up there. So that was one in 2014. We ended up doing our Series C, which we raised. We went from $11 million to raising 160 million. It was all primary capital, and that really opened us up quite a bit. It's actually what allowed us to do the acquisition of WooCommerce. WooCommerce is our e-commerce platform, which today can be probably will be as large of all of our other businesses combined. It did 31 billion in GMV sold last year. So this is one of the things that I think we've used outside capital for, and we've been very lucky to have investors which are very supportive of our long-term approach. But we're try to not follow we try to do the opposite of what the market is doing. So we do a lot of acquisitions and things in like 2008, 2014. Maybe we'll start to do some more now. But we try to hang back a little bit when things are getting a little frothy.
What's the secret to successful integration? M&A is fucking hard. Everyone
Yeah.
struggles on integration. How have you guys done it so well, so consistently?
I think it helps that we're totally distributed. So there's less of like a us versus them in the office or things. It was actually a big challenge when we bought Tumblr because they did have, pretty large office presence. About two-thirds of the company was in an office in New York. And so we had to bridge that. A lot of what we do is around like internal switchers. So often when you acquire a company, you're doing it or they're doing it partially because they want more resources. So one of the best things we can do when we buy something is take some of the best people at Automattic, the best engineers, the best designers, et cetera, and we rotate them in to the acquired business. And that builds a lot of bridges. It's kind of again, some of our best folks. So it's painful to remove them from other businesses, but then they give a really good impression of the rest of Automattic, and they can be embedded in essentially helping transform the culture. It's very much though the culture goes both ways. So you know, like Tumblr is a good example, like influenced the rest of Automattic's culture quite a bit, and now we have them using P2 and like all the things that we do. So there's I think that's pretty important. I guess it's kind of geeky, but the other thing is just really back-end integrations and making sure that you really prioritize the server infrastructure, how things are running, shared code bases, access. Like it's surprising sometimes even like months into acquisitions we've done that like a bug is being posted and people are like, I can't access that. And you're like, well, that's just silly. You need to have that internal transparency and ease of access for any sort of collaboration. So breaking down those walls as much as possible is really important for us.
Matt, I have to ask you, you mentioned taking over from Tony there in, I think, 2014 or 2015. We mentioned you're becoming CEO of Tumblr. In terms of delegation, how do you determine what to delegate versus what only you can do? And this is directly advice for me because I'm shit at it.
um, part of going from 10,000 feet to 1 foot is I do like to really deeply understand an area. And that I feel like helps me hire or recruit someone who's way better at it than me. And so for me, where uh, it's very, very easy to delegate is when I find someone who is so much better or maybe just enjoys it so much more than me that it's a joy to pass things off. So I'd say that's where it's gone well. And when I come into things, I do see it as a little bit of a failure in that it means that we haven't, found the right formula without me there. So I usually think of it like a temporary thing.
Can I ask you, mentioning kind of the failure and you having to jump in, I think that we learn a lot from lessons or mistakes that kind of go wrong. When you think about kind of painful lessons that you've learned, I do want to ask this one, which is what are the most difficult but valuable lessons you've learned in the automatic journey that although it sucks, you're pleased that you went through them?
Oh, everything we've talked about so far, there's usually an opposite side. So when we talked about good communication, like remember I was 19 when WordPress started, so I was a pretty terrible communicator for many of those years. So everything that's going right, I've definitely done wrong at some point, and unfortunately, sometimes my head's kind of think I need to do it wrong before I figure it out. Um, Tony was always really, really great at also he's very wise. He was a much more experienced executive than me, and but he would also give me some space to make my own mistakes. So, mistakes that come to mind, um, making capital expenditures when we shouldn't have, or put us in a tight cash position. Signing a lease for an office for Tumblr in like December 2019 to move in April
Ooh.
2020. So there's just different things, but there's something I learned from Tony actually is to try to make reversible decisions quickly and irreversible decisions very deliberately or slowly. So, uh, and if there is an irreversible decision, like apparently our lease was in New York, make sure that the cost, even if it goes wrong, is not existential. So I think a tremendous amount about risk management and longevity and
Hmm.
sustainability because, like I said, I do want to do this for decades. I think that you only get the grace and opportunity to do so if you're executing really well. If you look at folks who have been executives the longest, like it's typically because they're really firing on all cylinders. So that's part of why it's important for me for our businesses to do well, because it gives us the freedom and the optionality to run a business in the way that we want, which is a little bit different than many other businesses. Like pretty much all the software we make is open source, because I'm a big believer that open source is the future of humanity, and it's important that we create more of it. But if we were doing open source and the business was failing, guess what? We would lose that ability to do it. So the sustainability and the growth is actually a trailing metric, but it's a really important trailing metric of how well you're executing against your mission.
You mentioned risk management there. Ironically, for a venture investor, I don't love risk. Um,
Yeah,
how do
same.
you think about your relationship to risk?
Again, I think I got a lot of that out of my system in my 20s. Um, so now how I think about it is very much in the long term. What are the decisions now? And if you play out a decision that you're doing today and you say, okay, this continues for 5 years or 10 years from now, what does it look like? Um, we think about that with benefits. Like, let's say that, for example, we have a benefit that's a co working allowance. Um, although we don't have, outside this one in New York, we don't really have like offices in all the places we have employees. But we do give them an allowance of up to $250 per person per month. Um, to go to a co-working space or to go to a coffee shop and buy coffee so they don't get kicked out and things like that. And early on, one of the arguments was like, hey, instead of making this a reimbursable thing, like you go and you reimburse it, let's just like give it to everyone. Or maybe an example like let's pay for everyone's internet. And so, but when we thought about that, we thought, well, right now this benefit's used only by a small percentage of folks. The cost is relatively reasonable. It can scale up and down. Like during the pandemic, obviously usage of that co-working allowance went down a lot. But if you're paying 250 per month, 12 months a year, with 2,000 people, that's now $6 million per year. So that starts to add up to be quite a bit of money. And do we want to commit ourselves to that? Also, just the knowledge that benefits ratchet, meaning that people appreciate when you add them, but they're very unhappy when you remove them, even if it wasn't something they were using. So we think very, very much about uh, one-way doors. Raises are one-way doors. Hiring is somewhat of a one-way door for us because we have people who stay for a very, very long time. We have really high retention. So on those things, like make sure you're making the decision in a way that makes sense if it's successful and it happens for many, many years in the future.
Can I ask, and I hope this isn't too personal, but we mentioned kind of the risk in being much more long-term minded. Do you think that comes with increasing wealth? And I don't mean that rudely, but like as you make more money, you can afford the luxury of having a longer term mindset than worrying about rent or worrying about heating bills. How do you think about that in your relationship to money?
Yeah, 100%. It helps. This was actually something, in 2008, secondaries were relatively rare. Uh, they just weren't very common. But, a lot of credit to our investors at the time. In 2008, the company was only about 20 people, just about 2 years old, and we got an offer to sell for 200 million, uh, which, I owned a majority of the company. That would have been obviously life changing. And of course, we considered it from a variety of angles. But it felt like that was a small fraction of the impact that WordPress and Automattic could have in the coming years. And so what the investors did is they said, okay, let's take that 200 million, make it your new valuation. We'll invest money in that, and we'll put 10 million to the company, and then we'll allow you and Tony and other employees to like take a little bit off the table. Especially since my salary at that point was pretty low. I remember like 80 or 100K or something like that. So living in San Francisco, so they're like, hey, So, take a little bit off the table, de-risk, and focus on the long term on what you can build. Swing for the fences. And I think that was really, really helpful for me. And I try to think about that now more in our sort of base compensation is for people who work at Automatic, how can we get them to a base salary where they don't really have to worry about a lot of other things in their life. And so they can really focus their intention on the things that are most important to them, which hopefully are, having a huge impact, doing the best work of their careers during their workday, and then a rich and loving life in their non-work day.
I'm really using this just as an advice session. We mentioned kind of risk management there, personal approach to risk, and also challenges when things go wrong. I spoke to Tim Ferriss before this show about you, and he said you had two skills, world-class skills, and he said one of them is your zen-like mindset and your ability to just stay calm when the shit is truly hitting the fan. Um, and he asked, how do you retain this zen-like calm in the midst of challenging environments?
Huh. I think it's just a form of coping. So when something is really overwhelming, um, a way for me to try to get a handle on it is to sort of step back mentally a little bit and just try to dispassionately look at it, breathe, remind myself to breathe and other things, which comes from probably my saxophone days. You're about to walk on stage, your heart's racing, you're nervous, you got to breathe, otherwise you can't blow the horn. Um, and then also something, I don't remember where I read it or who said it, but like, is freaking out right now going to help the situation or make it worse? And 99% of the time, it's going to make it worse. So if something's challenging and we want to get through it, uh, the saying, if you're going through heck, keep going. Like, don't stop and hang out there. Like, keep going, and then look at what would be most helpful. And I find that actually very. It helps me get out of that part where my heart's racing, or I'm really stressed out. And so it probably looks on the outside like it's very calm. Internally, I'm probably freaking out a little bit, but then sort of coming back to that sort of centered place.
I love that in terms of breathing and ensuring to retain that sense of calm. I do want to ask, when you have those challenging moments and you have to retain that calm Zen mind, I think insecurity can often creep in and it stays long term afterwards.
Yeah.
Honestly, Matt, I listened to a lot of your shows beforehand, and you sound so calm and thoughtful that you're like, oh, this guy, he's got no insecurities. And I think it's quite humanizing to discuss. I think it's quite humanizing to discuss them. So, what would you say are your biggest insecurities in leadership today?
Oh, yeah. I will just say that I have all the normal human foibles and follies and issues. Um, Gosh, insecurity is what comes to mind is I've always been pretty insecure about my body, you know, like embarrassed to like take off my shirt at the swimming pool or something like that. On the leadership side, I would say a lot of my insecurity came from my inexperience and age. It's part of why I would read so many books because I was like, gosh, I really have no idea what I'm doing. I've never done this before. I need to learn something before everyone figures it out or I mess up this thing I really care about. Um, and I still like it still gets to me when even at our scale, and we've hired thousands of people, and over the years, a lot of people have left as well. Hundreds of people have left. Um, that still is tough for me, even at this level, where when you hire someone, you have all the hopes in the world, and so when that doesn't work out, it's still yeah, it still bothers me, and something I really try to think about, and also like think what could we have done differently, because it's not really fair to someone else as well to leave their previous job and everything else to come, and not being the environment where they feel like they can be successful.
I would love to unpack them. I've actually said it before publicly. I have bulimia for many years, and I still am have very challenge. It's very tough. You never lose an eating disorder, I don't think. Um, can I ask, where did your insecurity, self awareness over your body come from? Do you think?
Hmm. The earliest memory I have there were one. being at a swim meet in a Speedo and just like shivering on the side of the pool. And then I was a really slow swimmer, so I finished like a minute after everyone else, and just everyone like standing by the side of the pool watching me like struggle my way through it. So that was definitely an early one. And then the other one I remember was Little League Baseball. And, go up to you wear the uniform and everything, and you go up to the bat. I think this was T-ball probably. So the ball's on like a little stands. And I remember the kids in my dugout like really laughing at me because I had some sort of cartoons on my underwear, like Scooby-Doo or something. And it was visible through these, baseball uniform pants. And they started like laughing and yelling. And I was like, oh no, like, so those are two that I remember from a really young age.
God, this interview is so much more than you bargained for. On the second one,
I don't think I've talked about that publicly before, but thanks for
you,
bringing it
you,
up.
you're going to be like, Shaq, what did you get me into? On the second one about age and feeling like you hadn't done it before. You invest now as an angel. I obviously invest with funds. I'm constantly kind of stuck between the mindset with founders of great, I believe in the value of naivety and I believe in not knowing the challenges and then overcoming them because you didn't know they weren't possible. But then I've also been in situations where we've just been fucked because we could have avoided mistakes and situations that could have been known. Where do
Yeah.
you sit in that balance?
Let me say one thing on the last one just before we go is like I originally didn't remember those things. I just had the insecurities, but I actually did some hypnotherapy a few years ago. And one of the techniques was they'll be like, okay, go back. When was the first time you remember that feeling? Or go back and go back. And so those memories I just said were actually entirely self-conscious or subconscious, excuse me. Those self-conscious, subconscious memories. And it wasn't until like I did this kind of guided meditation that was able to figure out that that was probably still influencing me even as an adult when I haven't worn a Speedo in a long time. So it's an interesting tool. There's lots of tools for self-exploration. I think meditation and guided meditations, hypnotherapy can be really good ones for people to explore. And I forgot the question you just asked, so I apologize.
Not at all. My question was, how do you kind of sit in terms of the balance between the value of naivety and not knowing what's ahead of you versus very experienced, knowing what's coming and being aware of the pathway and the potential challenges ahead, which could stop you doing something great?
I've probably fall on the side of I prefer to come into things with a little bit more of a beginner's mind and really try to break down the problem area that you're tackling, whether that's for social networking, podcasting, web publishing, and because it's so easy for people to say like you can't do something or that's not possible. But it's nice and it's cliched now to talk about first principles thinking. But like I remember there was a technical issue we were challenging with or struggling with WordPress.com. Well, WordPress.com is like a massively multi-tenant kind of shared SaaS application. And people wanted to support plugins and themes for WordPress, which meant that we'd need to move you to essentially like a virtual private server where you had your own contained environment where you could run arbitrary code and just have a lot more flexibility that wouldn't affect the other folks in the multi-tenant architecture. And the design goal was, I was like, well, what if we could do this? Just you upload the plugin and it happens all in the background. Like while you think the plugin is uploading, we're actually moving your entire site and server and rerouting it at the gateway and everything to switch you from the multi-tenant to the sort of more isolated architecture. And originally, they were like, can't do that because the goal is under 30 seconds. But then we're like, well, okay, what takes longer than 30 seconds? Like, how much data are we talking about here? Like, how many megabytes? What's the speed of the network connection? What's the speed of the hard drives to read this and write it on the new place? Like, could we actually? And we got it down to where most of them take now under 15 seconds, and that feature has been working really well, and it actually drove like many years of enhanced growth for WordPress.com. But the original sort of reaction was like, oh, we shouldn't do that. We should just have like where how a lot of other folks do this, where you click the button, it shows like, hey, we'll email you in 15 minutes when it's done, and like that sort of thing. But yeah, breaking it down to kind of like what raw data is going across the wire and what are the speed limits there was really, really helpful.
Everyone always says, oh, leadership doesn't get easier over time. I honestly think that's bullshit. I think it does. Um, does leadership get easier over time or not?
Yeah, a book I love recently was Ray Dalio's Principles. And one of the things, what I loved about it is he says, like, over time with experience, you start to see, like, oh, this is another one of those things that I've seen before. And particularly if you can extract out patterns or commonalities between otherwise disparate events. And so, I have such incredible respect for experience. And, for most of my career, I've worked with people sometimes much older than me. And that's been one of the things that I felt like was really productive about our partnerships as they could bring in the experience of having seen a lot of these things before that were entirely new to me, and I could bring in like just a fresh look of not knowing what we can't do. And but you need both sides. I think if you have just one or the other, it's probably not great. But that's what's beautiful about building a team. Like when you put a really great team together, everyone's bringing a different background, a different point of view, different everything. And then that, allows you to, I think, saves you a ton of time, avoids you a ton of issues. And I love the idea as well as, having someone on the team whose job it is even to like attack the ideas and to really force them to defend themselves. So yeah, I like, that's why I think I love teams more than anything. Like for me, happiness is working with a great team um, on something I feel like is going to have an impact bigger than just our job or our revenue, and that people use. Making something that people use is incredibly rewarding. So you give me those three ingredients, and like I said, I would love to do this the rest of my life.
I listened to you on Tim Ferriss, and you said, you would, if you could change one thing, or if you knew you were going to die in a year, it would be like spend more time with friends, and
Mhm.
correlating that to happiness. And I spoke to Hugo Bauer, I spoke to Daniel, I spoke to Shaq, I spoke to Tony Schneider, Tim Ferriss, and the depth of their friendship with you was so wonderful to hear. And it just made me think on a couple of things. But first is like, what does truly great friendship mean to you?
A friend is someone who calls you out. I always joke that like if you have something in your teeth, like a stranger might not tell you, but a true friend will always tell you if you have something in your teeth because it's kind of saving you from walking around all day with a poppy seed in there or something. Um, I do appreciate vulnerability. I think being vulnerable with your friends and making space for them to be vulnerable with you is really powerful. Like we all want to be heard and understood. Um, what I'm bad at and trying to get better at is actually asking for help when I need it. If I'm going through a really challenging situation or tough time, I tend to kind of go in a cave and like withdraw. And all my friends are like, hey, like that's when we want to be there for you. Like but we can't if you don't tell us. So that's something that's been
What
on my mind recently.
why do you think you're bad at that? Is it because you don't want to open up and admit that you're struggling? Is it because you think you can do it on your own? What do you think is the reason?
Yeah, there's probably some embarrassment or shame there. There's also just that through my life, I've been able to get through a lot of tough things just by kind of white knuckling it, like really like diving in and working crazy hours or doing something really gargantuan. Um, but that doesn't always work. And there's some things in life that you can't white knuckle that because they're completely out of your control or influence. So having someone honestly just to talk to about it is really, really valuable. And that's something I
Have
really
have
appreciate.
you have you ever seen therapists? When I went through very bulimic kind of schedules and episodes, I saw therapists for many years, and probably still need therapists for many years. But have you ever spoken to them, and how did you find that? If so,
Not a formal therapist, but I've worked with a lot of teachers over the years who have done very therapy-like things with me, including a coach I work with now called Joe Hudson, who actually has a really great. He shares a lot of his stuff online now. So uh, it's been, I think, self-awareness is kind of know thyself before you can
Mm.
change anything else. And where I see leaders struggle the most, including companies I invest in, is typically where they're being driven by some forces which they're not fully aware of. And that might cause them to be snappy or tense or act out of fear rather than in abundance. And All these things, some sound really woo-woo, and sometimes I do these things, like, a friend will bring me in, I'm like, "This is total, like, woo-woo crystal stuff," but I'll try anything at least once, and I try to look for the wisdom in even things that I think are a little ridiculous, uh, particularly if it's, like, from an older modality or something that's been around for a long time. It's like, "Okay, why has this survived so long?" Or, "Why do people like it?" Or even if I think it's totally, made up, why are people drawn to it? What is it promising that people are drawn to? So, um, yeah, approaching these things with an open mind, I think, is really, really helpful for all of this. Like, you have to be open minded for it to work. If you just go into it being like, this is never going to work for me, or I'm going to prove I'm wrong. You'll be right. It won't work for you.
On friendship, I spoke to Shaq, and I'm quoting him here. He said, Matt is always there when it matters, always. Birthdays, special events, if it's special, he's there. We met at Shaq's wedding. And, seeing obviously at Brilliant Minds and other events. To do this, though, you have to manage your time very well. And so, my question to you, and same from Hugo in particular, was first, how do you manage your time?
That's a good question. Like, I make a lot of lists. I use Simplenote and Day One quite a bit to make like extensive notes and list of things. Um, I manage my time by working with really great people who make me better, including, you know, my super amazing assistants, Mo and Shiva, and others that like really kind of help me operate at a higher level. And yeah, I do like the philosophy of like eat the frog, where if there's something really I don't want to do in a day or I'm procrastinating or putting off, I try to do that first. With a joke that being that like if you have to eat a frog on a Tuesday, don't wait until the end of the day. Like do it first thing and then just get it over with. So that is probably my best time management tip. Everything else, it's my days are so different because I'm moving between our businesses quite a bit. I'm often in different physical locations quite a bit, and so it's not really a typical day. So I just try to really triage. I'm a very fast typist. I love being on the computer, so those things definitely help for kind of keeping on top of things.
What have you stopped or started recently that's made a big difference? So, like for me, I stopped drinking in the week, and I noticed
Mm,
that made a big difference. Actually, I still drink on the weekends, and
mhm,
have a great time then. But weekdays, no. Is there anything that you've
mhm.
stopped or started that has made a big difference?
Mm. The two best things in the past couple of years that were interesting for me was actually the COVID lockdown when I stopped traveling. In 2019, I think I did over 500,000 air miles. So I was really traveling quite a bit. And, that went to zero for a while there. So that was interesting because I realized that once I was in a single place all the time, all my excuses kind of fell away. Because before I'd be like, oh, I'm not exercising because I'm on the road or like, or whatever it is. So like when I stopped doing that, I really had to face a lot of things that I think I've been running away from a little bit.
What did you learn
And
about yourself at that time? Because it does reveal a little bit about who you are and what you really want.
I found I had a lot of resistance to these things. So, uh, yeah, I would say that I think I learned the importance of consistency. So typically what I've done in the past is like, I won't work out for a while and then I'll like work out every day. And then I end up hurting myself and then I stop. So like that kind of feast or famine, I think for things like exercise is not the most effective approach. By the way, I know I'm the world's least expert on this, but at least that's been my experience so far. Versus the consistency of doing even just a little bit every day, I found felt a lot better, was easier to accomplish, and got honestly better results. So that consistency, I think, applies to a lot of things, whether it's meditation, investing in your close relationships to make sure you're, not just spending time around each other, but really like listening to each other, talking to each other. Uh, yeah, the consistency matters a lot. We were talking about friendships. One of my favorite things is also seeing how friendships and people develop over the long term. I feel really lucky that the people I worked with when I first moved to San Francisco, like Phil Black or Tony Schneider, um, Tony Conrad, I still work with today. But seeing how people change over time is also really inspiring to me that I could change over time.
I love Phil in particular, absolute favorite. What a hero he is. I hope it's okay for me to ask, but I listened to your episode with Tony in Antarctica, and in the beginning, you spoke about your father's passing and actually the pre-grieving process being a very significant time for you. I was interested when listening and thinking about it. What did you learn about yourself in that pre-grieving process, and how did that impact how you think?
Mm. I only realized it later. So at the moment, I didn't realize what was happening. But I was so searching, his situation and his illness was very much out of my control. So I was really searching for things I could control. Um, so I actually got really strict about like my diet and exercise and all these other things because I was just trying to grasp on to something in the universe. And it was afterwards that I realized that um, I was going through a grieving process, even though he was still there. And I read a great book by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross called Grief and Grieving. She's, one of the uh, academics that came up with the 5 stages of grief. Like anger, denial, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. I think are the 5. So yeah, that book sort of revealed both the things I had gone through before but not been aware of, and then also after his passing, because a friend from high school actually gave it to me. So I read it, and after he passed, and then just kind of seeing how myself, my mom, and my sister were grieving so differently, and originally that made me kind of angry. Um, one of the anger phases for me is like, how can the world go on? How can people just act like things are normal? But then sort of understanding that it's a very personal process and like people grieve differently at different times. And so I think about that now as well when someone is facing a loss, whether it happens or not, that they are going to respond differently and that that's okay and that it's really important to support them in however they're going through that pre-grieving process. So, uh, again, just something that if there's one bright side that can come out of a loss like that, it's that when someone else is going through something similar, perhaps you can be there. And much like my friend gave me that book, like help them understand what's going on a little bit better.
I always think our parents shape us in ways that we don't expect or anticipate. When you think about your father, are there one or two big takeaways or lessons that you learned from him in terms of how you think, how you act, how you operate?
Hmm. You know, one of my early memories of my dad were him waking up super early in the morning before the sun was out. This was when I was so young, I would sleep in my parents' bed. And, he would shower, he'd put on a suit. He was a computer programmer, but at that time you had to wear like a suit and a tie and get his briefcase and just like without fail be super early in the morning, like first person in the office. And then he would take me sometimes on weekends. So he would go into the office on like extra days, which was my favorite thing because then he'd stick me at one of the other workstations and I get access to the, T1 internet or something. Um, but just like he's just work ethic was really incredible. Uh, that was definitely one, and just he was always incredibly straightforward, you know? The, you'd always know. Yeah, he was just a very genuine person, and that sort of high integrity you would see throughout every single aspect of his life, and just has always been really inspiring to me, both as an example, but also just in how much simplicity it adds to life if you're the same person in all context. If you lie, you have to keep track of it. Where if you could just tell the truth all the time, you have one less thing to keep track of. All you have to keep track of is reality. So I feel like that example, yeah, still serves as an inspiration to me today.
Did he see your success with WordPress?
He did. So he passed in 2016. So yeah, Automatic had been around for 11 years. WordPress had really started to become a bigger thing. And one of the things that really touched me because he did start saying "I love you" kind of in the, last 5 or 10 years of his life, where he wasn't overly demonstrative when we were super young. But after he passed, some of his folks at his office told me how he would never really talk about me, but sometimes when there was a press article or news article, he'd come in and kind of put it on the wall in the break room. They had like a little pin board, and I never knew that. And that really uh, made me cry and made me really happy because it helped me see that, yeah, he was following along and a big supporter.
Man, that's super special. I'm sorry for going deeper there, but I really appreciate you opening up and discussing it. I do want to move into a quick fire round. So I say a short statement, you give me your immediate thoughts. Does that sound okay?
Sounds great.
What's the favorite book and why?
Oh, my favorite book right now is probably this one, actually. It's called Some by David Eagleman. And it's 40 Tales from the Afterlives. And he's actually like a science writer, but this is kind of a fiction. And it's all short stories. They're really kind of mind-bending and amazing. And it's a nice bedtime read. So to read one like right before you go to bed.
What would you say is your biggest strength and then your biggest weakness? 30 seconds on each.
Oh, I think my biggest strength is definitely the people I work with. Um, and my biggest weakness is definitely probably pride, that not asking for help.
Totally. Can I ask, what's the hardest element of your role with Automatic today?
Hmm. This is both an automatic and my life is right now and often I feel stretched very thin. So
Mm.
like I can't spend as much time or do as much with everything we have going on, especially as the company's now gotten to thousands of people. So yeah, that's my biggest struggle.
What advice do you often give but find it hard to follow yourself?
I meditate.
Okay, totally. What do you know now that you wish you'd known at the start of Automatic as a 19-year-old? What would you tell yourself?
Hmm. That it's going to be okay. I think there were times when it felt like very existential and just knowing that like, when it's over, it's going to be okay. And if it's not okay, it's not over.
What would you say is Shaq's greatest superpower? I always say to him, he sees and believes in people before they even believe in themselves. He did with me,
Uh,
he has done with many others. What would you say his is? You've known him for many, many years.
I mean, yours I would agree with. So let me add another one. Maybe not his greatest, but something I get really inspired by him is his ability to think of a situation or a problem from every single angle. He talks a lot about loving friction-free logistics. And part of that is like anticipating every single possible thing in every interaction and planning for it or countering for it. And I find that super inspiring and something I aspire to, like in our experiences or when I host something or, you know,
I mean, it is just exceptional. I totally agree with you there. I'm always amazed. I want to finish on the final one, which is what do the next 5 years hold for you, Matt? And what's the plan ahead? If we do this in 2027, where do we want to be?
oh, broadly, Automatic's mission is to democratize publishing and commerce. And one thing that's been excited as we've grown is being able to expand into other areas, like social networking with Tumblr, podcasting with Pocket Cast, personal journaling with Day One. So, but all these things fit together in that kind of like making a more open web where people can express themselves. So, my hope in 2027 and over the next 5 years is that the web is a lot more creative, a lot weirder, that people have a lot more control over it versus just being another profile on Twitter or Facebook, and more fun. I think that when you do these things right, it allows an expression of human creativity and individuality, which traditional web properties they really try to fit everyone into the same boxes and very cookie cutter. And that's not how humanity is. The beauty of humanity is in the diversity and uniqueness of each individual. And so we need to be able to express that individually online better. So I hope that we are able to create tools which allow people to do that more and that the tools get adopted more and more.
Matt, it did take time for us to do this, but it's shows like this that make me so appreciate doing what I do. Thank you so much for being so brilliant. And I really so love this discussion.
Gary, and I hope that we're next time in London, we'll be able to hang again. Looking forward to it.